whenever you are watching at home. I know that many people have wondered this before, and it's something that I've wondered as well, trying to figure out the difference between a raven and a crow. Like, do you know the difference between a raven and a crow? Like, there's a number of differences. Some people know this better than others. Yes, size is one of them. Shannon knows that. Ravens are bigger than crows. I think they have different shaped beaks. Crows are smarter than ravens? I didn't know that. But one of the distinguishing differences between crows and ravens is the number of feathers that they have on their wings. So the wing feathers are called pinions. Have you heard that before? I had to write it down. A raven has 17 pinions, while a crow only has 16 pinions. So that means that the difference between a raven and a crow is really just a matter of opinion. Oh, there it is. Well, that's your opinion. But I am of the opinion that forgiveness is absolutely central to our Anabaptist theology. You see how I made that transition right there? If you're not familiar with the Anabaptist tradition traces all the way back to the 16th century. And under this larger umbrella, we have the Mennonite Church, we have the Amish Church, churches like the Church of the Brethren, and various other groups like the Hutterites. And I believe that this is absolutely central to our theology. Forgiveness is a part of who we are. It is in our DNA. Now, I think about all the stories of the Bible where Jesus not only forgave people, but told us to also forgive. And we tend to lift up Jesus as our perfect example of how to live, and his teachings as something that are central to our life. So Jesus said things like, forgive others people, just as I've forgiven you. He taught in the Sermon on the Mount, as he taught them this prayer called the Lord's Prayer. He says, he prays, Lord, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us. When Peter asks, how many times should I forgive a brother who sins against me? Jesus says, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And as I mentioned to the children here, he models that for us as well. He practices what he preaches. As Jesus is there on the cross, he forgives the people who are doing the deed. The people who are putting to death, Jesus forgives right there. So forgiveness is absolutely central to our theology. It's central to who we are. And I looked at our text for today. I looked at the lectionary. I went through the different passages. The passage from the New Testament was Jesus and the Canaanite woman where he calls her a dog. And I'm like, you know what? This is going to be a lot easier. Forgiveness is going to be something I can preach on without any problem whatsoever. And I sent out my message to Curtis, our song leader, to Dwayne, our worship leader. And like, yeah, we're going to focus on forgiveness. And then I started digging into the story. And as Dwayne mentioned, this is messy. Like this is tricky. This is ugly stuff here. And I think if we jump too quickly ahead to forgiveness, we do a disservice to this story. And we probably do a disservice to our own stories as well. This is a story about betrayal. This is a story about human trafficking. This is a story about lying and deception. This is a story about power and oppressive economic systems. I'm going there, Dwayne. I know you were ready. All of this is included in this story. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to retell the story. We're going to probably have to miss a few spots, leave out a few stories, because Joseph spans a large section of the book of Genesis. And it's been one of my favorite stories from the Bible. And now looking back on it, I'm like, oh, this is really quite messed up. And what I want to show you today, even though sometimes we lift up Joseph as a perfect example of forgiveness, because there is that beautiful scene where he and his brothers are weeping together, Joseph is not perfect. So if I knock down one of your heroes here of the Bible, I apologize a little bit. But remember, Joseph is not perfect. We are not perfect. Only Jesus is perfect. So let's go ahead and look at the story of Joseph as told in the book of Genesis to find out just how we could do this thing called forgiveness a little bit better. Now, a quick reminder is that this is Joseph from the Old Testament. This is not the earthly father of Jesus. This is not the guy that marries Mary in the New Testament. This is way before any of that happened. This is Joseph, who is born to Jacob. And Jacob is the guy who marries two sisters, like you do. It's totally normal. He marries two sisters, and when you marry two sisters, one of them, is his favorite wife, and the other one is less favored. You can imagine that causes some division within the family. So here Jacob marries Leah, the older sister. He also marries Rachel, the younger one. And Leah begins to have many children for Jacob. She has 10 sons and a number of daughters. I forgot the exact number as well. But she has a litter of kids. Most of them being male. Rachel, however, struggles to have children. His favorite wife is rather infertile. She finally does have a child. She has a boy, and they name him Joseph. Now, Joseph quickly becomes the favorite son of Jacob. And he has these 10 half-brothers, which I'm not good at math, but I think that makes 5 brothers. He's got something like that. I know I even worked that one into my script. That was funny. He has these 10 half-brothers, and he knows he's the favorite. If you're the favorite, you know it. He's walking around. He knows that he is his father's favorite. And his dad even gives him a special coat. It's this coat with long sleeves, and it's made of many different colors. And he's just kind of walking around. He's got that strut going around his brothers. And he's like, hey, brothers, look what my dad gave me. Our dad gave me this coat. And not only that, he can't just leave it at that. He has this gift. Joseph can interpret dreams. And he has this dream. And he goes to his brother and says, let me tell you about this dream that I had. There's this dream where God says, you're all going to bow down and worship me. I have brothers. And let me just say, that sort of thing doesn't go over well. Joseph kept pushing it and pushing it. He knew he was favored, and it came back to bite him. So what do his brothers do? They throw him in a pit and sell him to traveling merchants. Those traveling merchants then take Joseph down to Egypt to sell him as a slave. Boys will be boys, right? That's what you do. They took his coat, that coat of many colors, that unique coat. They dipped it in blood. They took it to their father and said, we found this in the woods. Joseph must have been mauled by an animal. He's dead. Oh no, what do we do? So the entire time, Jacob goes through thinking that his favorite son from his favorite wife has been killed. And these brothers have this secret they live with for a number of years. If we follow Joseph's story, I can't tell you every story, we find that he has these ups and downs as he's sold into slavery in Egypt. And eventually he finds himself in prison for a crime that he did not commit. But remember, Joseph had this gift. He had this ability to interpret dreams. And one day Pharaoh, the most powerful leader in the land, hears about Joseph's gifts, and he brings him to him and tells him about his dreams, these reoccurring dreams. You have these reoccurring dreams. I won't tell you about the dream I had last night. Sonia and I had an interesting conversation this morning, but that's not for now. Pharaoh has these dreams, and he brings Joseph in and says, what does this mean? And Joseph says, this means there will be 7 years of abundance in Egypt. There will be plenty of fruit produced, grain produced, and then after those 7 years will be followed by 7 years of drought, of famine. There will not be enough food in this land. So that was given to Joseph from God. And then Joseph kind of goes off on his own. He starts telling Pharaoh what he thinks Pharaoh should do. We find this in verse 41, verse 34. This is Joseph speaking. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Well, all once Pharaoh's here, he's thinking, this Joseph guy, he's on to something. He can see that he's a man of God. He can see that he's full of wisdom. He has a plan. Save up some grain. Whenever you have this abundance, store it. Take it from the people and build barns to keep this so that when there is not enough, you'll be able to distribute it. Pharaoh sees this gift in Joseph, and he makes him the second most powerful person in the land. I love the text between this one and the next one. It talks about how Pharaoh gives him this gold chain to wear and a fancy ring as well. And I'm just like, he's one like gold tooth away from being a 1990s rapper. Right? Like it's Biggie and DMX and and Joseph. Right? Okay, so Pharaoh appoints him second in command. These years of abundance, they occur. He collects all this grain. And then we come to the next passage, 4156b through 457. Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. So let's pause right there for a little bit, do a little bit of unpacking. There's something in this story that I hadn't realized, I hadn't heard until a couple years ago. I heard an Old Testament scholar named Walter Brueggemann speaking on this. And Brueggemann points out something. You'll notice that I had a few words underlined in each of these verses. The first one, I had underlined that they took a fifth of the harvest from Egypt. They did not buy that grain from the people. They did not offer to store it from them. What's it say? They took it. Now, that's not really surprising to me because we pay taxes, right? Nobody actually asked me for that money. It comes straight out of my paycheck. If you don't pay that, they come looking for you. I hear stories. So that sounds like a tax. And that's actually kind of consistent with how much tax we pay. 20% is kind of in the neighborhood for many of our households. But they never ask, they never say anything, they just take this grain. It is required that they give this grain. And then what does it say in the next one? Then they sold the grain back to the people. Wait a second. So they took the grain away from them and didn't give them anything and then sold it to the people. And the people had no other options. They had no other choice. Like imagine you have no food. There's only one person who has food. This person has a monopoly on the food. You must go to that person. And if you want food for your family, you have to pay that price. And if you notice here in the passage, it doesn't say that God said to do any of this. This was all Joseph's idea. And you notice that right here, we have the beginnings of really a corrupt economic system where Joseph gets extremely wealthy from all of these exchanges. Joseph was this guy, this poor little boy, this slave boy sold to the Egyptians. And now when he rises to the position of power, what does he do? He abuses his power. Because absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. All right, we return to the story, and we have Jacob still down in like the area of Canaan, and the famine has affected them as well. And Jacob says to his 10 sons, and now he has another son too, another child is born to Rachel. And he says to his 10 sons, go down to Egypt and buy land, or buy food for us, and then bring it back. And they leave the youngest son, Benjamin, there. The other 10 go down to talk to this guy that they hear has all this food. And they go down and they start talking to this guy, and they don't know who it is, because Joseph has shaved his beard. Traditionally, the Hebrew people have a long beard. He shaved that to live among the Egyptians. And he doesn't let on that he knows how to speak their language. He talks to his brothers through a translator. But Joseph knows who they are. They just don't know who he is. And these 10 brothers, these half-brothers of Joseph, come before him, and they ask for grain. And he does what? He messes with them. Again, like all good brothers would do, he messes with them and he throws them in jail for 3 days. He says, you are here to spy on us. Throws them in jail. After 3 days go by, he lets them come before him again, and they try to explain themselves. No, our father, he's still living. He's very old. He sent us here. We have one more brother that's still living back with father. Like, this is not an espionage mission. We are here to get grain. And he says he doesn't believe them. He says, leave one brother here as collateral. Go down and bring that brother back to me. Because Joseph didn't know he had this other full brother. Bring that brother back to me. Then I'll give you grain. Then I'll leave your other brother, Simeon, free. So they start traveling back. They were able to get grain from Joseph. They're traveling back. And as they get close to home, somebody checks their bag. And not only is it full of grain, Joseph has had one of his servants put the money that they gave for the grain back in the bags. So now it looks like they have stolen either the grain or stolen it's silver, stolen their silver back from Joseph. They don't know what to do. They can't go back because, like, Joseph already doesn't trust them. They don't know it's Joseph. Joseph doesn't trust them. They can't go and bring Benjamin. If they bring Benjamin back like he asked, maybe he'll keep Benjamin. They don't know what to do. So they go to their father and they wait. They use that grain. And eventually it's all gone. They've got to go back to Joseph. And against Jacob's desires, they take Benjamin with them. And they all come before Joseph and explain what went on. They're like, I don't know how this money got back in my bag, which is what everybody who steals would say, right? Defense attorneys are out there, yep. I don't know how it showed up there. I've used that defense time myself as well. But Joseph goes along with it for a little bit. He spends a little time with them, fills their bags again with grain, and the brothers brought twice as much silver back with them. They're going to pay double for this grain. They also gave him gifts, and he sends them back home. And again, Joseph puts all that silver back in their bags. But this time, he takes his silver cup, worth a lot of money, and puts it in one specific bag. He puts it in Benjamin's bag, his father's favorite son. And they start back, and he sends his messenger up to say, hey, somebody took my cup. Somebody took Joseph's cup. And they said, no, nobody here would take that cup. What are you talking about? We're legit. We're not going to do something like that. And they said, well, let's start looking around. And they said, if you find that cup in somebody's bag, that brother will become your slave forever. Well, sure enough, whose bag did they put the cup in? It was in the youngest one. It's in Benjamin's cup. So now they all go back because they're like, oh, obviously they are trying to steal from Joseph. They don't know what's going on. They're all confused. They're upset because now Jacob's favorite son is about to become a lifelong slave of this tyrant in Egypt. And it's only then they start telling him about all that's going on. They're like, our father is going to be heartbroken. Our father is going to die when he hears that Benjamin will not be coming home. And it's only when all this goes on that Joseph finally breaks down and says, gotcha. I'm just messing with you. It's me, Joseph. It was me the whole time. Ha ha! Zing! Bazinga, right? We make light of this whole story, but this is Joseph is a real jerk. Not that he didn't receive some bad stuff along the way. Absolutely, he was sold into slavery by his brothers. That was terrible. This isn't just a story about forgiveness. This is a story about revenge. If we jump ahead to the end of the story, hope you're not in a hurry today. We jump ahead to the end of the story, we find that his brothers never truly trusted Joseph again. Genesis 50, verse 15 says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, this is a couple years later, when they saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? These groups were never fully reconciled. Joseph maybe forgave the people, but they never fully forgave him. There's still this tension years later going on within this family. This is a messy, messy situation. And I think that Joseph kind of exemplifies this phrase that you've maybe heard before. And this phrase doesn't apply universally to all people, but I've seen it happen, and you've probably seen it happen as well. The phrase is, hurt people hurt people. If you have been hurt, and you do not take steps towards healing, if you don't do anything about that, if you don't try to forgive, if you don't try to be reconciled, if you don't work through your feelings, your processes, your counseling or something, you end up hurting other people as well. And what we see in the story of Joseph is this guy who has been hurt rises into a position of power where he can use that power to hurt people, even the people that he calls his own brothers. So keep that in mind for just a second. We're going to go on a tangent and we'll bring it back together. Now, I know that many of you are, like me, you are over the age of 40 years old, so you probably remember something called apartheid. You remember apartheid? Apartheid was an official position within South Africa from the years 1948 through 1991. This was like government-sanctioned racial segregation. In apartheid in South Africa, there were different groups based on how dark their skin was. There were white people, there were black people, and there were colored people in the middle. So colored people was kind of a catch-all for somewhere in the middle. If you were not very dark, you kind of fell in that middle category. So this racial segregation, it's not unfamiliar to those of us that are aware of our own past here in the South. There were places that if you were a colored person or a black person, you were not allowed to go. If you were certain people couldn't worship together. You couldn't live in the same neighborhood as people. You couldn't marry a person of a different race. This was all a part of apartheid. I had a friend just a couple years older than I am. He's probably mid-40s. And he was born and raised in South Africa. And I remember having conversations with him about apartheid. He's just like, I just knew that I couldn't go in parts of the city. And it's just like, well, you just couldn't go there because he was considered colored based on the color of his skin. Well, obviously, like here in the United States, there were a lot of people that resisted apartheid. And you maybe have heard the name Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was thrown in jail for resisting apartheid. The official charges against him were insurrection against the state. And he was in jail from 1961 to 1990. I guess close to, 30 years of his life spent in jail. So towards the end of 1990, as apartheid was coming to an end, Nelson Mandela was released. And there's this time of real racial tension in South Africa. And if you were alive during that time, you maybe know what happened next. What happened in 1994? He got elected as what? He got elected as president. So here we have a story that sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Doesn't this sound like the story of Joseph? We have somebody who was oppressed, somebody who was considered lower than other people. He was in prison, and all at once he moves to one of the most powerful positions in the nation. You got to think this is going to make some people uncomfortable, right? Some people are starting to get a little bit worried. And who do you think is going to be worried? Well, it's going to be the people who had done the oppressing. They're like, all at once, no, I'm worried because I know what I did to this guy, and now he's got the power. He's going to do it back to me or my children or my children's children. Now, Nelson Mandela was not a perfect man. I don't lift him up as a perfect example. Just like Joseph, he had his flaws. But I really liked some of these words that Nelson Mandela spoke, some of the attitude that he had during this time. This is a long quote, but I'll read it for you. As Nelson Mandela reflected on his experience becoming president, he said, "I knew as well as I knew anything that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken from me. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. When I walked out of prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both." Hurt people some of the time, unless they make steps toward healing and reconciliation, unless they take steps toward forgiving. And as I said, this is something that we Mennonites, we're a humble people, but we like to brag about our forgiveness, right? Forgive me if I sound a little bit braggadocious here. I don't mean to just lift up our Anabaptist tradition, but there's some things that we do right. And I think that one of the examples of forgiveness that we often go to is a perfect example of what this looks like within our Anabaptist tradition. And that's the 2006 shooting in the Amish schoolhouse in Pennsylvania. You remember this story, perhaps. Early one morning on a school day, as the children are gathered in this building, this one-room schoolhouse, a gunman breaks into the school and holds the female school children and teachers captive, releasing the boys. He later goes through and he shoots 10 of these women and children. 5 of them die. Some of them continue to live today with long-term permanent handicaps. The man, after killing these 5 girls execution style, then turns the gun on himself. Now, many of us know this story for multiple reasons. We know this story because it's just something that is atrocious. That's a terrible act of a human being against another human being. But one of the stories that comes out of this story is the act of the Amish people in reaching out to the family of the man who killed these girls and women. Because they reached out, and what did they do? They offered forgiveness. They realized that the family of the shooter had lost a family member as well. They realized that they were going through a lot themselves, dealing with a lot of things. So they reached out and said, we do not hold you responsible. We do not hold this man like in our anger. We forgive you. And not only that, they continue to support the family of the shooter. What you may not know is this is not a one-off occurrence. This is something that we teach and something we preach frequently in the church. Even as recently as a couple years ago, during the pandemic, in Kitchener, Ontario. Any Canadians in the group? There are no Canadians. In Kitchener, Ontario, there was a farmer, a Mennonite farmer, who was driving his tractor down the road one day, minding his own business, when a milk truck pops over a hill, doesn't see the tractor, and crashes into the tractor, killing the man on the tractor, Daniel Martin, age, I think, 40, I wrote it down somewhere, 46 years old. Left behind a wife and 7 children. We don't know for sure if that truck driver was speeding. We don't know for sure if he was playing with his phone, checking his text messages, whatever he might have been doing. But he didn't see the tractor, didn't bother to slow down. He killed the man right then and there. And some of you can help me, maybe this is true in the United States as well, but in Canada, the victims of an atrocious act like this have a chance to speak into the sentencing process. And the family gave what's called a victim impact statement. And this comes from the family of Daniel Martin. It said, anyone can have an accident. We hope the driver can deal with the trauma of the accident, and we can thank him for having the presence of mind to administer CPR. We want the driver to know that the whole family does not hold anything against him. And if there was some negligence in watching traffic, we forgive him for that. We hope he does not need to go to jail and he can get on with his life and forgive himself. I said this is in our DNA because early in the 16th century, when the first Anabaptists were persecuted for their beliefs, many of them were burned at the stake or they were drowned in the river. They called it a third baptism. They put them in the river and said, if you're truly following Jesus, let him save you. But we hear these stories and we have them documented about how our Anabaptist forebears were being persecuted and tortured and killed. And as they were tied to the pyre, ready to be lit on fire, the last words out of many of their mouths were words of forgiveness. Much like Jesus himself on the cross, these Mennonites, these Anabaptists forgave the people who were putting them to death. Now, we have not always done this well. I'll be the first to admit that. We've made mistakes. We have forced women to forgive their husbands when their husbands have abused them, physically, mentally, sexually, however it might be. Force them. This has been the practice of some churches, to force these women to stay in their relationships and forgive. We force people to forgive on our timeline, saying it must be done fast because this is the way it's been done elsewhere. And I just want to say I repent of that on behalf of the tradition. We've made some mistakes, but yet I still think forgiveness needs to be central to what we are and who we are as a people. And I heard a very excellent podcast recently. Actually, it was a YouTube video. I'll send it out with the sermon this week. A woman by the name of Sarah Montana. I think she's Hannah's sister. Had to lighten it up a little bit there. Sarah Montana shares her story of forgiveness after her mother and brother were shot, brutally murdered in their home overnight by a thief who came in to try to steal from them. And the walk that she had through theology and philosophy and trying to figure out not only why she must forgive, but how to forgive. And one of the takeaway messages that she has in this TED Talk is she says this. She says, when you forgive someone, you are telling them, you are more than what you did to me. That is recognizing the humanity of the person who many people would simply want to dismiss. Many people would simply want to see them rot in jail. She's saying, no, that doesn't help me. That doesn't help anybody. That person, too, is a human created in the image of God. They are more to me than what they did to me. That means that the people who burned our Anabaptist forebears at the pyres, they're more than what they did to them. The people or the man who shot the girls in the Amish schoolhouse is more than what he did to those people. The milk truck driver that killed Daniel Martin is more than that one act. He was a beloved child of God as well. And when we forgive, we recognize the humanity in the other as well. So we think about Joseph, and no, Joseph was not perfect. He made some mistakes. But thankfully, he did forgive his brothers. I think we can learn from that how to do it better. And today we are reminded, I'll invite Sandy to come forward. We are reminded of the one who taught us to forgive one another. The one who forgave even his killers as he hung on the cross. We're reminded of Jesus himself, who on the night when he was betrayed, gathered in the upper room with his disciples